Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Humanities Day. Welcome to this talk. I want to talk today in a general way. Can you all hear me, by the way? Is this mic? Yeah. Is there anything I could do to... What? Oh, it's just for the camera. Oh, there's no... Okay. All right, I'll shout. Okay, I'll step up closer. So I want to talk about a worry, a puzzlement that besets contemporary philosophy very widely. And I think, in fact, at least in the area that I work in, the philosophy of mind, almost every piece of scholarship that you'll see published today is in some way informed by this worry, shows the mark of this concern, shows some desire to get behind it or understand it or get past it. Can you hear me now? Is that okay? Okay. All right. But it's not just a worry that professional philosophers, people who are paid to write about philosophy, teach philosophy, have. I think it's a worry that many people have or have had. Maybe they don't think about it as explicitly or as often as a professional philosopher, but it's there sometimes to be reflected upon. I suspect everybody here, at least all of you who came by your own volition instead of being dragged here by someone, probably have this worry. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come to a talk with this name. Okay. It's a worry about the mind, and in its most general kind of inchoate form. It's the worry that the mind is unacceptably mysterious. It's the sense that there's something about it we need to understand, but we don't. And every attempt we undergo to achieve that understanding is unsatisfying, and we find that to be so. And so we're left forever with this lingering worry. That's what I want to talk about today. Now, what is the mind, to begin with? In fact, I don't think that's a good question. I think talking about the mind and asking what it is can be misleading because it just takes for granted that there's this thing, the mind, that we need to understand. There's like this sphere, this autonomous realm where special things take place. And that's what we need to dive into and get our minds around. And that spatial imagery can be harmless, but it can also be potentially problematic. And so I'd rather ask the question not what is the mind, but what is it to have a mind? That is, what kinds of capacities do things need to have, do creatures need to have for us to think of them as having a mind? And on the face of it, there are a bunch of interrelated capacities, and they're easy to list. The kinds of things we associate with the mental or with the mind. Thinking, reflecting, the capacity to form beliefs or to acquire a knowledge about the world around you, often through perception. The capacity to feel pain and other sensations, the capacity to feel emotions, to form ends, to adopt means toward ends and pursue those ends in action, practical thought, to express our thought or our feelings in language, to form images, visual images, auditory images, maybe other kinds. Those seem to be the core capacities that we associate with the realm of the mental. Is there some thread that unites them all such that we link them in that way? I think there are many such threads. I actually don't want to talk about that now. I'm going to get into that kind of indirectly, but it's a complicated question. Suffice for now to say, that's the kind of stuff we think of as the mind. And that's the kind of stuff that we can find elusive or mysterious. Now, the first thing to say about this worry is that we don't have it when we're just actively engaged in using our minds. When we're just thinking about stuff, about whatever, planning something, trying to decide what to think about the presidential election, whatever. I'm not going to say anything about that. Feeling some pain and wanting to deal with that or whatever. Everything seems transparent to us, right? So suppose your friend says to you, to take a plebeian, mundane example, do you want to go to lunch tomorrow? And you think it over and you form a decision. Maybe you think, if your life's as boring as mine, you might think, well, I was going to spend my lunch hour going to Walgreens to get a prescription, but I could do that later. I haven't seen this guy in a while. It'll be really fun. What the hell? I'm going to go with you. Let's do it. That whole process of thought, there's nothing more transparent when you're doing it. You know what you think. You know that you think. You know why you think what you think. And you know what you decide. It's only when we step back from thought, when we try to achieve in a certain kind of way a perspective on it from outside it, when we try to look at it from a different place than the place that we have, the kind of knowledge that we have when we're simply immersed in exercising our mental capacities. And from there, when we try to integrate it into a wider world, that the worry arises. So I want to talk about why we're led to think we need to do that and what we even think it might be. And what I want to suggest is the worry has no solution. That is, if you take it seriously, if you seek the kind of understanding that I just gestured at metaphorically as stepping outside of thought and finding a way to integrate it into the world, you're never going to be satisfied. There is no such understanding to be had. So what do? What we need to do is free ourselves of the worry by coming to see that it's not obligatory. And we could do that by coming to see that the demand for that kind of understanding is confused, is a mistake. It's very hard not to feel the pressure toward achieving this in our intellectual time and place, but we don't have to, and in fact we can't because there's nothing there to be had. Now, I can't make a decisive case for that super sweeping claim in the 40 minutes I'm going to talk, or now 35 or what have you. But what I want to do is really just carve out a place for finding that kind of solution to this worry. I just want to bring it into view. And to do that, I need to start with a little broad brush historical, very sweeping historical background, kind of get us to the moment where we are now, where we can see why we have this worry and what shape it takes. So let's go way back to Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher in ancient Greece about 2,400 years ago or so. He was not afflicted by the worry that I just mentioned at all. He knew that the mind was special. He recognized that creatures with minds have very distinctive capacities that others don't have. He was well aware of that. He emphasized it. We're very different from other animals, he thought, and we're even more different from things like rocks. And the difference is fundamentally a matter of thought, and in particular for Aristotle, it's a matter of having the capacity of reason, where the capacity of reason is to be guided in what you think and do by considerations of what's right or correct or justified or good or worthwhile, in terms of some norm, in terms of some reason. He said we are reasoning creatures. We adjust what we do and think in light of our recognition of what it's right to think or what it's good to do, and that makes us special. Rocks don't have that at all. Cats, well, I mean, cats have something, right? They are certainly aware of their surroundings. They can feel pain. They can pursue their needs. But it's hard to ascribe to them a capacity for reason in the sense I was just talking about. Even the most ardent cat lover or owner, like me, for example, is going to have a hard time thinking that you're looking at your cat thinking, the cat is thinking, you know, I'm hungry right now, but maybe eating isn't the best thing to do. I mean, there might be other kinds of pursuits, so I'll just set that aside. Cats, they don't do that. They can't step back from their needs in that kind of way. But we can, and for Aristotle, that was crucial.
A little louder?
Sure, I'll try. I should have brought like a megaphone. So for Aristotle, we're special, but that doesn't make us mysterious. That doesn't make our situation problematic. If anything, it makes everything else a little bit mysterious. That was Aristotle's perspective. I said a few minutes ago that you don't have the worry about the mind when you're immersed just in thinking. When you're just actively engaged in thinking, you understand it from the inside. You know it. Aristotle took that kind of understanding extremely seriously. He thought we're rational thinkers, so we know rational thought as well as we know anything. He wasn't troubled by that. Take, for an example, something he focused on a lot, which in the tradition since Aristotle and Kant has come to be called practical reason or practical inference. That's where you self-consciously pursue a goal. So to take a simple example, another just basic, mundane, everyday thing, suppose you want a beer, and there's none in the fridge. And so you think, I think there might be some in the back of the closet from that party I threw a couple months ago, so you go rooting around in the closet. Then a friend comes up to you and says, what are you doing? Why are you rooting around the closet? You can explain why you're doing that. You say, well, I want some beer, and I think there's some in the back of the closet. There's none in the fridge, but I threw this party, etc. That explains perfectly well why you do what you do. Your friend can understand it. You can understand yourself. What puzzled Aristotle was not why you go rooting around in the closet, so much as why, say, a flame rises or earth falls. Things made out of matter fall when you release them and they're not on something. Precisely because they don't think. They don't set ends for themselves in thought. They don't represent goals to themselves and act in pursuit of them. So why did they do what they do? That's the question. Now, for Aristotle, the power of purposive thinking, of that model of explanation, that pattern of explanation that he thought, well, philosophers can play a role in making it clear in a general way, and that's what I'm going to do, but which all of us possess, simply in virtue of being competent, practical agents who engage with ourselves and others, which those concepts we understand as well as we understand any concepts, he was tempted to say, let's apply them elsewhere, even to things like rocks or flames. So you find hints in Aristotle of a thought like this. A flame goes up because its proper place is to be up high, and it's striving to achieve its proper place in the cosmos. Earth goes down because its proper place is down here, so it's striving to get to its proper place. That is to take the form of purposive explanation that we know about from our activity as practical agents, as people who have goals and thought and pursue them, and applying them to other things. And he even would apply them to very basic categories. I have on the handout a quote that I'm not going to read, because it's like anything that Aristotle wrote, it's super dense and very complicated. But just a couple things I want to draw attention to. He's explaining here why change is continuous. And he says nature always strives after the better. Okay, and he doesn't just mean the thinking parts of nature, us. He means everything. He means the rocks, the planets. Everything strives after the better. Now you might think, what kind of sense does that make, given that flames and rocks and all that stuff don't think? They don't form goals in the way that we do. Well, there's a hint in Aristotle that we do appeal to thought to explain this. So another thing to notice in this quote is the mention of God. The role it assigns to God is that God adopted the better alternative when it comes to various questions about how change can be, because it's the better alternative. Now, what is God? Well, for Aristotle, it's the ultimate cause of everything. It's the prime mover, the cause of all motion. But he also said in a passage that became incredibly influential in the Christian tradition that it's thought thinking itself. Whatever that meant to him, I'm not going to try to say, it's clear that he's placing thinking at the bottom of his account of nature. The ultimate explanation of everything is somehow in terms of movements of thought. Now, Aristotle doesn't say much about what God is, really. He doesn't give much of a clue. The work being done there in those passages and others is really with the notion of thought and the association of God with thought. And how does he know what thought is? Not by contemplating God, by contemplating himself and other people. He knows what thought is. He knows what practical thought is in particular, as every other human being who knows those things knows it, through being, becoming, a practical thinker and being able to interact with and understand other agents. That's how he knows what he's talking about. Now, Aristotle was taken up with great enthusiasm in the Islamic tradition. He was translated into Arabic. That was in the early medieval period, and then in the late medieval period, he was translated into Latin and became extremely influential in the Catholic tradition. He was integrated into Christian theology, and for people in that faith, those thoughts and ideas still reverberate, right? The significance remains. In particular, Thomas Aquinas, the famous philosopher and theologian of the 13th century, basically identified the Christian God with the God of Aristotle. And he took up a lot of Aristotle's ideas. The idea that everything has an end, the idea that those ends are ultimately to be understood in terms of God, in terms of his intellect, his will, his thinking. For Aquinas, those were extremely powerful explanatory ideas. So that's just to say, unlike what I suggested, the position we were in the beginning of this talk, for Aristotle and Aquinas, there's no call to find a place for thought in the world. There's no need to find an alternative perspective on thought and see how to integrate it in something else. I mean, this is overstating it a little bit, but for them it's almost the reverse. Their aim is not to find a place for thought in the larger natural world. It's to find a place for the larger natural world in thought. And once they do that, once they find that the forms whose fundamental home is in our thinking about ourselves and other people in nature, then they feel they've understood it. That's not how things are for us. Now, for most of us, for the culture. For us, the demand is to find a place for thought in the world, to find a way of thinking about thought outside the exercise of it that explains its place in a larger picture. Now, if that's true, then our intellectual context has to be really different from the intellectual context of Aquinas and Aristotle, because they have a very different concern. They have a very different sense of what needs to be understood and explained. And indeed, we do have a very different intellectual context in a whole lot of different ways. And one very obvious way is in the so-called scientific revolution, which happened a couple centuries after Aquinas. So let me just briefly say a little bit about that. It gets us one step closer to our worry. This is very, again, broad brush history. So you find in the scientific revolution, that period, 1500s, 1600s, and beyond, great advances in physics, in optics, then in chemistry, life sciences. Part of this was just because technology for observation got much better, like the telescope. But there were also evolutions in math. There was self-consciousness about experimental methodology. There was a new understanding of the idea of a law of nature. I mean, these things were continuous with the past, but they did change and they did have significant implications for what people ended up thinking and for how science developed. And one thing that especially happened was a rejection of the idea that we can appeal to ends or purposes to explain nature. So for example, Francis Bacon, a famous early exponent of the scientific method, you find, I have this passage I put in the handout. I'll read this one. Bacon says, although the most general principles in nature ought to be held merely positive as they are discovered, and cannot with truth be referred to a cause, nevertheless, the human understanding, being unable to rest, still seeks something prior in the order of nature. And then it is that in struggling toward that which is further off, it falls back upon that which is nearer at hand, namely on final causes, which have relation clearly to the nature of man, rather than to the nature of the universe, and from this source of strangely defiled philosophy. He's saying here, look, we find these regularities in nature, and we're tempted to find out what lies behind them or grounds them or explains them. And we're tempted to appeal to purposes or ends that natural things have, perhaps imposed by God. Final cause is an Aristotelian word for end or purpose. But he says that when we do that, we're projecting, we're anthropomorphizing. We're taking a concept whose home is in our thinking about ourselves and other people as we pursue our self-consciously adopted ends. And we're applying it to the world in general. And he thought that that was bound to fail. It was going to just lead to misunderstanding and confusion. He said if you want to know what lies behind these regularities, what you need to do is through extremely careful observation and experiment, penetrate into the mechanisms, the laws, and what he called the remote parts of nature, maybe the very, very small. And the only way you can do that is by not assuming there's going to be some easy symmetry between the ways we have of thinking about ourselves as we live our lives and the way the universe is. On the contrary, Bacon thought the universe is basically a strange place, that it's going to go against common sense and received notions. And that to find those mechanisms, you're going to have to shed your sense that it's just going to mirror the way we are. And you're going to have to let the observations lead you where they do. Now, Bacon was 100% right about all of that, I think. It's clear. The development of modern science shows that. Bacon, by the way, was not a non-religious person. His point was not, don't believe in God. His claim was if we want an understanding of nature, don't achieve it by just jumping to ends that you find in everything, say, imposed by God. Rather, do the rigorous work of spelling out scientific theory on the basis of observation. Now, he was right, because the history of modern science is a history of success, but it's a history of shedding ideas that we understood and models we had for thinking about the world that made us comfortable, toward ways of thinking about the world that are very hard to grasp. For one thing, they're incredibly mathematically sophisticated and complicated. They involve very elusive ideas. They're just hard to wrap your mind around. But that's how science is developed. Okay. Now, we're getting close to having the Worrian view that I mentioned, but we're not quite there. We need 2 more steps. Okay. So Bacon rejects the Aristotelian Thomistic, that is to say, like Aquinas, like Thomas Aquinas's, approach to understanding nature where you find purposes or ends or ways for things to properly be in it. He says instead, find brutally mechanical laws and mechanisms that explain why things happen. Okay, fine. But what about us? What about, say, you're going into the closet to look for beer? Surely in that case, we can just appeal to an end. I mean, Bacon's point was don't take what's proper to human nature and throw it onto the world, but take human nature, take what we do. Surely there, when we're talking about what human beings do and think, we can appeal to reason. We can appeal in particular to purposes and ends and all that stuff, represented in thought and followed through on. Well, in fact, for many philosophers these days, it's not so simple. They worry about that. And the reason is, natural science seems to be so successful, so awe-inspiring in its reach, in its achievements, in what it's contributed to how we can understand the world, that there's a natural thought that everything can be explained in terms of the natural sciences completely. Everything includes stuff that happens to us, right? And that means in particular things like you going into the closet. Everything that's true about a rock, it seems, can be explained in terms of physics, chemistry, and related things. We're made of the same stuff. How could that not also be true of us? That's the thought. Everything about a human being, then, has to be explicable in terms of the natural sciences. That view is often called naturalism, and I have a statement of it on the handout, I believe. It's that everything that happens in the universe can be understood in terms of the natural sciences. Now, this generates a problem, or at any rate, a tension between 2 things that we think. One thing that we think is that among the things that happen in the universe is that we believe stuff, and we do stuff, and we reason, and we act on the basis of what we reason. And we form beliefs on the basis of what we come to know and what we reflect about. That's among the stuff that happens in the universe. Right? But the other thing is our commitment to naturalism, which tells us that everything that happens has to be explicable in terms of the natural sciences. And when you explain something in terms of thought, in terms of reason, you're not doing natural science. That was Bacon's message. So the question is, what do we make of our own self-understanding as rational beings who think and feel and act in pursuit of what we want, who believe things when we see that they're true, and so on? That's the problem of naturalism, about which there's almost everything in the philosophy of mind these days, literally, is on this problem in one form or another. There's parallel problems in moral philosophy, too. And the guiding thread of all of this is everything has to be explicable in terms of the natural sciences. We have these forms for thinking about ourselves that don't seem natural scientific. We say stuff about ourselves in those ways. What do we make of it? Now, there's various strategies for solving this problem, and I don't think any of them succeed. I think for reasons of time and my voice, I'm going to skip two of them. So I'm going to skip section 5 on the handout. Okay. So I want to talk about what is by far the most popular strategy in philosophy for solving the problem of naturalism. And the strategy is called naturalization. You do this thing in philosophy. You naturalize. You naturalize the mind. What does that mean? It means show it to be natural. And what that means in particular, given naturalism, is show it to be fully explicable in terms of the natural sciences. That's what many, many philosophers set themselves the task of doing. Now, to see the flavor of the problem, I just want to say a quick word about the kind of understanding we're talking about here. Let's forget about the rational stuff like thinking, believing. Let's take a simpler case in some ways, feeling pain. Okay. We can say a lot of things in natural science about pain. We can explain some of its causes, neurophysiologically and so on. And that science is often very useful, like in medicine. Sometimes we say the cause of this pain is a mystery. Sometimes we know the cause of the pain. So in that way, pain falls within the ambit of natural science in the sense that we can identify causes of pain. We can say what leads to pain, what kind of mechanisms can be used to block pain, all that stuff. That's not what naturalists want. They want something different, which is often called not a causal, but a constitutive account of the mind, of pain in this case in particular. What does that mean? A constitutive account is not a claim about what leads to something, it's a claim about what it is, what its nature is, what its essence is, whatever fancy word you want to use. We have various ways in philosophy and outside of philosophy for making claims like this. We might say being an F consists in being a G, not is caused by, consists in. Being an F is constituted by G-ness. What makes something an F is that it's a G. That's the kind of claim that naturalists want to make about, say, pain. You can see the contrast between the two in a famous distinction drawn in a Platonic dialogue from thousands of years ago, in the Euthyphro. I just have an example in the handout. In that dialogue, Socrates is talking with this guy, Euthyphro, about piety. And he gets Euthyphro to distinguish between two different claims about the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods. And they're on the handout. The first claim is what it is to be pious is to be loved by the gods. That's a constitutive claim. It says, look, all it takes to be pious is to be loved by the gods. That's all being pious is. If you're loved by the gods, it's guaranteed that you're pious because there's nothing more to being pious than the gods loving you. That's its essence. The second claim, being pious causes one to be loved by the gods, also sets up a correlation between piety and God-belovedness, but not by saying that piety is God-belovedness, but by saying that God-belovedness is caused by piety. The second claim says something like, the gods see that you're pious, and they dig it, and so they love you. That's why pious people are loved by the gods. That actually requires that piety be distinct from being loved by the gods so that it can be a cause of it. So the second claim leaves open a question that the first claim doesn't leave open. The question is, but what is piety? The first claim tells you, it's just being loved by the gods. Second claim doesn't tell you that. Learning that this or that neurophysiological process leads to pain in certain patients, that kind of claim leaves open a question. But the question is, but what is pain? And what naturalists want is an account in the natural sciences of what pain is. And so they will say things like, here's a famous early example of a claim of this kind. I put it on the handout, from like the 50s. A person's being in pain consists in nothing more than their C fibers firing. That was something that people used to say. Now people say something different. C fibers are these fibers that are receptive of neuropathic pain. Right? That's a claim about what pain is. Or take a more metaphorical example from this naturalist Fred Dretske. I have a quote on the handout. He says of his project, by which he wrote many, many books. Many people have written many, many books in this project. The entire project can be viewed as an exercise in naturalism. Can you bake a mental cake using only physical yeast and flour? Obviously, that's a metaphor, but it's a suggestive metaphor. Because in a cake, it's not really that the yeast and the flour cause the cake. They don't bring it about. They are the cake, right? They are what constitutes the cake. They're the ingredients of the cake. Saying my being in pain consists in C fibers firing is meant to say, not that it causes my pain, it just is it. So the reason naturalists want that is because then pain turns out to be fully capturable within natural sciences, in this case, neurophysics. The thought is like our ordinary talk about pain and desire and belief and intention and goals, none of that represents what we're talking about as natural, if the natural is everything that the natural sciences cover, because those aren't terms from any natural science. But we can take everything we say when we talk about someone's beliefs or desires or pains, and we can, as it were, translate it into neurophysiological talk or some other kind of talk, and thereby show that the fundamental essence of these things is naturally, scientifically tractable. That's the naturalistic project, the project of naturalization. Now, this is a fanciful claim, perhaps, but I think even if you've never been acquainted with any of this literature directly, that if you're puzzled by the status of the mind and you think it's mysterious, it's because you feel to a degree that something like this needs to be done, but that it doesn't really make sense. I think we all feel the force of a claim like, oh, that's really what pain is. Oh, okay. It's got to be that way. The scientists, the philosophers have told us this. But none of us actually understand that claim. Just don't even know what it means. That's what I want to suggest. That's why we're worried. That's why the mind seems mysterious. So let me just say very quickly a little bit about why I think those claims will turn out to be meaningless. There's much more sophisticated kinds of claims that philosophers make these days in terms of cognitive science, but I think the problem still arises there. I have a long quote from Wittgenstein on the handout. I'm not going to read it, it's too long. But Wittgenstein was an early 20th century philosopher. But basically the gist of it is this. He's thinking about someone who says thoughts are located in the head. And he wants to know what that's supposed to mean, if it's not a metaphor. And the person says, well, I'm a neuroscientist, and I have a It's a primitive example, he says, it doesn't matter. I have a mirror, and I cut open my skull, and I think the thought that it's raining, and whenever I think that thought, there's a certain part of my brain where I can see the neurons firing. And when I don't think that thought, that part of the brain doesn't fire. So that thought is located there. My thought is those neurons firing. And what Wittgenstein wants to say about that is not that it's wrong, but now he understands what you mean when you say that your thought is located in the head, and all that you mean is you've observed a correlation between that part of your brain firing and you're thinking that. You know that when you think the one thing, that thing happens. That's all it means. You haven't succeeded in giving it any more meaning than that. But you want to. The point is not just that they're correlated. The point is that the one is the other. And that, Wittgenstein wants to say, you just haven't succeeded in funding or making sense of for us. Philosophers since Wittgenstein or naturalists have tried to do that in various ways, but I think they all fail. I think there comes a point in any such theory where there's this bridge that we're supposed to, it's a leap of faith, crossover, from pain to sea fibers, from thought to some very complicated idea in computational science. And we just don't understand the claim. And let me just say one more word about that. Just to kind of state what I want to say about the worry, not really make the case. The problem is a naturalizer doesn't want to give up our ordinary concepts of beliefs or pain or any of that stuff. She needs to hold on to them. Her whole point is to show us that what we say when we use those concepts or those words captures something that can be fully captured in natural science as well. And for that to be a claim we can understand, to make sense of, we still have to have our old way of thinking. And we have to be able to see that those two things link up. We don't abandon the old way of thinking. In the section that I skipped, there's a kind of philosopher who argues that we should just give up thinking about beliefs. It's a different kind of view. It doesn't make sense. The naturalist wants to say, look, hold on to your talk about thinking. I'm going to show you it's really capturing the stuff that can be explained over here. And the problem is that from the perspective of those concepts, we just have no way of getting a grip on what it would be to identify them with this over here. I mean, we understand the words in the sentence, but understanding a bunch of words isn't enough to understand what's being said. If I said the number 4 is under the table, that's grammatical. You don't know what I mean. I have to tell you what I mean. And then whatever I tell you, that's all that I meant. And so if the person who's making this kind of claim about the relationship between a thought and the brain says, well, I've observed a correlation, well, that's all that you've meant. You want to say something more, but we don't even know what it is. Now, that is what I think the modern worry about the mind is. It's in light of that little intellectual history, we're at a place where we feel it has to be right to somehow see thought and all of those related mental capacities constituted by something we can grasp in physics or neurophysiology or whatever, some natural science, but we don't understand. We delude ourselves if we think we understand what those connections are even supposed to amount to. So what do we do then? Well, final minute, I'll just say, what that amounts to is to say that this worry can't be satisfied directly. You're not going to be able to achieve the outside understanding from outside thought that shows you how it has a grip in the natural world. Because that whole project, that's just an image, and when we try to cash out the image, we never get really a grasp of it. But maybe we don't have to even think we need such a thing. We shouldn't go back to the Aristotelian Thomistic way of thinking about nature as having ends written into it. But we don't have to. We can think that natural science explains a whole lot of stuff and it doesn't appeal to ends, but there's at least one kind of happening where you do need to appeal to thought, to reason, to purpose, and that's in human beings engaging with the world, which is, after all, the home of those concepts, right? It's in our thinking about ourselves and other thinkers that we ever had any basis for applying them. That is just something different from natural science. That doesn't mean it isn't natural. We just have to find a way of being comfortable with accepting it as an unreducible part of our picture of the world. That's really evidently hard to do, but I think that's what we need to do, because the alternative is to be beset by this worry that we can never actually resolve. Thank you.